All right. Good morning, everybody. We have some exciting research updates to share today. We have Sandy Dietz of Whitewater Gardens Farm who will be sharing final results from the SARE project she's been doing, looking at no-till production methods and diversified vegetable systems. And then we will hear from Genger about some of their research updates. So I will pass it over to you, Sandy. Thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, sure. Thank you. What I'm going to do is I'll do a quick introduction and a quick overview of the first year of our study, and then I'll get into the second year and what we plan on doing afterwards. Uh, okay, how's
All right,
that?
we can see your slides.
Okay, good. So I'm Sandy Dietz. My husband Lonnie and I have Whitewater Gardens Farm. We're in southeast Minnesota. We've been farming here for well, this is our 30th year that we've been farming here and doing organic produce, selling to local markets, farmers markets, restaurants, and co-ops. We purchased our farm in 1990, began growing for market in 94. All of the cropland on the farm at the time was in the Conservation Reserve Program. It had been for over 10 years, but when we took some land out to start trying to grow, we realized there was absolutely no topsoil left on this farm. It had a hard pan, white hard pan, about 8 inches, 6 to 8 inches below the soil, and we had a hard time getting anything to grow. When it was in conservation reserve, it was just in brome and it held the soil in place, but it didn't regenerate the soil at all. And this farm was farmed so poorly. It was kind of the story of, the buried fence rows, that type of thing. We did have fence posts just sticking a foot out of the ground in some of the lower areas. So we started working with building our soil and have literally grown ever since. Built organic matter up and through cover crops and mulching and things like that. We got rid of that hard pan. Right now um, we're growing on about um, 5 acres, a little bit less. A lot of that is in cover at any given time. We were growing at around 15 acres before, but we're trying to slow down. We're getting old enough that we're not trying to get out completely, but definitely slow down. But anyway, we still have a large greenhouse that we utilize. It's 46 by 126 foot 2 bay gutter connect that was built for all season growing, but we have the past several years been shutting it down for a couple of months in the winter. We've got a 30 by 96 foot hoop house, a 30 by 48 foot propagation house, and two 16 by 96 foot hoop houses. The picture on the lower right shows the big greenhouse and our log boiler, which we just sold this year. So that's pretty much the end of our winter growing. The crops that we pretty much specialize in are sweet potatoes and carrots, which seems really strange with the problems with the soil we've had, but we found in raised bed systems, we can get these crops growing quite well. Another crop that we do quite a bit of, and I had to throw this picture in here because I just love this, is fresh baby ginger. We had some beautiful ginger this year. Oops. So over the years, what we have been doing to try to regenerate or build our soil is using cover crops. We've got enough land here that we can rest some of the fields, for a full season. And I really like to do multi-species cover crops because we can let it go for a full season. I am trying to, or hopefully build, the soil biology using different crops and things like that. Um, these are two pictures of the same field. One earlier in the year where it's showing buckwheat and sorghum sudan. There was millet in there, sun hemp, uh, red clover, things like that. And then we had later in the year we had sunflowers. And what we had done was we had mowed it after the sunflowers. Whatever came up again, we let winter kill, and then we were able to use the field the next year. This was another cover crop just from this year with a lot of sun hemp. There was some oats in there and field peas. Because of our soil issues with this farm, we and are slowing down and trying to manage with fewer people working. We got really interested in no-till or minimal till practices and in watching other practices, other farms using different practices. Um, some I felt a little uncomfortable with just for the fact that a lot of them use a lot of plastic, and um, we're trying to cut way back on the plastic usage on the farm here. And then I see a lot of deep compost mulch, which I had questions about, being that we've had some issues with some imbalances with certain mulches. Um, so we decided to do some comparisons um, on different no-till methods and we took three methods and then compared them to our regular tilled beds. We did deep compost, we did cut and carry, we did a living mulch because I got really interested in hearing some of the information on that, and then our control beds. The first year of our grant was for fall cauliflower. That gave us some time to prepare beds, um, getting an early cover on it, mowing that down, and prepping our beds for later in the year. We used a randomized plot layout. They were 100-foot long beds, 3 repetitions of each treatment. And when I talk about terminating a crop or mowing paths or whatever, we do that with a BCS walk behind tractor with a flail mower attachment. We've used that. That's probably one of my most favorite tools on the farm here. I love the fact that we can mow and it drops everything in place, and we can mow fairly low with it. This is a compost that we used. We used a purple cow compost, which was, fully plant-based compost. It probably doesn't make any difference, but for certain crops around here, I like to get my nitrogen from leguminous cover crops rather than, manure-based composts or whatever. And I have no proof whatsoever, but I think it makes a little bit of a difference in the flavor of our carrots and our sweet potatoes. I have no problem with using manure or manure-based compost on other crops. It's just areas where we tend to use those in rotation. So we decided, since this was an area that we do a lot of, we do sweet potatoes in, we just did a plant-based. The hay mulch, the cut and carry mulch that we used was a dairy grade alfalfa hay that we chopped with a landscape mulcher. I chose the alfalfa hoping to add nutrients to the soil versus just a straw mulch. And you can see on the mulcher or the landscape mulcher, we could blow the mulch out onto the field, but the beds were too tight to be able to do that and not get too much mulch in the other beds. Not to mention the fact that when you blow it out on a field, it doesn't get it real even. You have thick spots and thin spots. This was just a photo of our newly planted cauliflower. And it was an interesting year. We started this in 2023. It's supposed to be a 2-year grant, but for various reasons, it ended up being 3 years. So we had extreme drought that year, and we did water with a line of drip tape in each row, and we tried to water the equivalent of at least an inch of moisture a week. But the plants didn't do anything most of the year. They just sat there surviving but not thriving. We started getting rains later on in the year and then they took off. But you can see a little bit of difference here in some of the beds. The picture on the right, you can see the compost on the upper right-hand corner. The cauliflower did really well in that. I believe it was the cut and carry mulch in the center of that one. It did very well. It was the control bed on the left, and they stayed fairly stunted and not real happy. We checked compaction, which didn't vary a lot throughout the beds regardless of treatment. But we had a lot of gopher issues. So we ran into gopher holes that ran the length of the beds quite often. And you can see in the center of this picture where they totally ate a good quarter of all the plants we had out there. The end of the season, we had a field day, just going over results, got great feedback on ideas where we could go from here. So this is it's supposed to be year 2. It was actually year 3. And the first year was extreme drought. The second year started out with extreme moisture that we couldn't get in there and get any work done. So we applied for and were granted an extension. So this past year, we did year 2 of the grant project. And this year we planted king crimson sweet bell peppers. So in between times to prepare for the year, when we could get into the beds, we went in on the control beds and seeded a cover crop. We mowed down the cut and carry or the living mulch, which we had problems the whole time getting any clover to establish. Ended up having to seed it a third time, just trying to get the clover to establish. And then the other mulch beds we covered with weed fabric that we kept on or tried to keep on for the winter. This is the highest part of our farm, and we had a lot of wind and not much snow over the winter, so we kept having to replace the plastic, and it was futile. A lot of the plastic didn't stay. On the beds that the plastic did stay, it did keep the beds pretty clean. But we went in the next spring then and tilled the control beds, mowed everything else down, seeded paths again, seeded the living mulch beds again. And then we went and we actually planted before we mulched this time to make sure we got good contact with the soil, being there was quite a bit of residue and weeds wanting to come in. And we planted them using a bulb attachment to a handheld drill. Drilled a hole and placed the peppers in there, and that worked really, really well. So some of our results on the second year with the peppers, the picture on the left is a control bed. Plants did fairly well. Good color. There was quite a bit of fruit, but definitely dirty from rains. The picture on the right was the deep compost, and surprisingly, those plants stayed pretty yellow. They never got real good color. We fought weeds constantly, quackgrass especially, was creeping in from the sides. They bore a lot of fruit. probably medium to small sized, and they colored quickly, but I think they colored quickly because of the stress. Um, the picture on the left here was the cut and carry mulch. Those were the happiest plants. They had beautiful color. We mulched a little bit late, so it took them a little while to start, really taking off and fruiting, but they became covered with blossoms and a lot of fruit. Um, the living mulch beds, I think I can safely say, were pretty much a failure with this experiment because we couldn't get a good batch of clover established. When it did grow this year, it was looking pretty good, and then all of a sudden died back, and weeds came in, especially asters for some reason. Um, and the plants basically were stunted and produced, for all practical purposes, nothing. Um, I've got some graphs here, and I, don't want to bore anybody with looking at too many graphs, but there was a couple things that stood out. This is just three of the Haney test scores, but the final one on the right showed most of the beds going backwards, with the exception of the cut and carry mulch. That one, it definitely improved. Now, we didn't add any kind of amendments or anything to any of this. I wanted to see what these treatments did all on their own. And not real sure why everything else went so far backwards, but I was pretty surprised at how that mulch had improved. Organic matter, not surprisingly, the compost beds were much, much higher. These were in a pretty poor soil area, so there wasn't a lot of organic matter there to begin with, but most of them stayed pretty level except for the compost. We tried to move the compost when we took the samples because I wanted to see what the soil was like more underneath, but I'm sure some of the compost got in there. So that could be one of the reasons the organic matter went so high. Phosphorus levels, the the compost, deep compost mulch, we are we already had high phosphorus levels. A couple were kind of medium, several very high. Those went through the roof with the compost. Um, Magnesium, we were already high in magnesium levels, and there again, the compost went a lot higher. Everything else stayed pretty much the same. pH levels, we were at a pretty good level, but there the compost started bringing it a little bit higher than we were comfortable with. And some of these issues could be the reasons those plants were yellowing. Um, Nitrogen levels, on the other hand, everything went down with the exception of the cut and carry mulch. I think the other beds, being that this was at the end of the year and the first example is at the beginning of the season, a lot of it could have leached or been used up by the crop involved. But the cut and carry mulch, it rose considerably, and could be because it was a um, alfalfa hay that we used, and it could have been pretty high nitrogen in that alfalfa. It would be really interesting to compare alfalfa to straw. And when we did the soil food web tests, the biology didn't change a lot. Just some minor changes in there, but stayed pretty level across the board. And that kind of surprised me. I expected to see some bigger differences in the biology, but I really didn't. At the end of this year, or at the end of 2025, we had, instead of having a field day, we had a roundtable discussion where we presented the results of the research and discussed, why some of the findings showed up maybe the way they did. We talked a lot about different soil biology and nutrient issues. We did do some. We had people. We invited people to bring in compost samples and things, so we put some of those under the microscope. It was a really, really great discussion, a really lively discussion, and we had such a mix of people there. We had university people, we had SWCD people, we had vegetable farmers, gardeners, grazers, crop farmers. It was just such a diverse group, and it was really fun because everybody was, shooting for the same thing and trying to improve soil. Um, it was really great. And what I loved about this discussion too is a lot of the people wanted to keep up the discussion. They want to get or keep a group going in the area. We had people come from pretty good distances, but um, they want to get together and visit people's farms and look at what they're doing. And it was a lot of fun, and it was definitely a successful um, discussion. So back or from what we learned from this research or have gathered from this research is kind of a hybrid of everything that we did. I may not do total no-till. I'm gonna say that we're probably leaning more towards minimal till, a lot because of our crop rotation, a lot because of the issues we had with weeds coming into beds and things like that. But um, I think we'll probably start, you know, our rotation with a year of cover crop again. Um, Multi-species cover crop that for the most part will be cover crops that can winter kill to make it easier the next year. Then would probably go, the next year in our rotation would probably go to our sweet potatoes. We do use plastic in our sweet potato beds, um, but we do not cultivate the paths. We mow the paths, and that helps our sweet potatoes in two ways. It helps us be able to get into the fields when it's wet, to work in there. But when the sweet potatoes meander across those paths, then there's less energy going to the roots. So every time we mow it, we mow off some of those vines, and it puts more energy into producing the crop again. Um, Another thing that's nice about doing the sweet potatoes this way is after we harvest, it sets us up perfectly for a couple years of minimal or no-till beds. We've got the paths in place. What I think we will probably do from here on is use kind of a combination of adding some compost to feed and then using a cut and carry mulch for most of the crops. Um, I think, it would be fun to see the difference between using a straw mulch, excuse me, and the hay mulch. Um, and we might play around with that. But I think we can utilize these beds for a couple good years. Our sweet potatoes, we usually do a 4-year rotation on. So if we utilize these beds for, say 2 years before quack can get in there too bad or whatever, and use a cut and carry mulch, and then also amend if we need to, and I think what we may utilize even more than other amendments is like compost extractions or biological extractions, try to get that biology working so that the mulch that we're using can break down and feed the soil and feed the crop. Um, it tends to be the way we're thinking about going on this. And hopefully that will work for us. Then after, a couple years of that, we put it into the entire field into a cover crop again and start the whole process over. So this is why I'm thinking of that cut and carry mulch because this is from a bed that we had cut and carry mulch on, um, and had lightly worked it in, not deep, but just shallowly worked it in. And over the course of the year, I love the biology I saw in the soil. We didn't test it, but just about everywhere we went to work, we saw the biology, and I get pretty excited about that. So if we can do that, I think we can build our soil a whole lot quicker. So I think that is the end of what I've got. Is there any questions?
Thanks so much, Sandy. Yeah, feel free to put questions in the chat or come off mute with any questions you have.
I don't know how I did time-wise.
Sandy, I have a question when you talked about slightly working in the cut and carry in that last picture where you liked all the biology. How did you actually slightly work in that? Like, what did you use? How did you do it?
Well, and that's a question that I've had before. I think it's going through with a tiller, but trying to keep it as shallow as possible. And just going through once, trying not to beat the soil up and not to go down too deep, but just get a good contact
Okay.
with that mulch.
So we have a BCS as well, and we have I think it's called a power harrow that's kind of tills, but it kind of stirs the soil. I'm just wondering how that would have worked, maybe with something like that to be able to do that.
I think that would work out really good. I think we did have this conversation the last time we presented too.
Oh, okay.
But it's kind of deja vu. I think that would work out really well. And I think my response is probably the same as what I had said before. When we bought the BCS, we were kind of limited to how many attachments we could get. And I was so focused on that flail mower.
Yeah.
So if I could add attachments again, I think it would probably be the harrow.
Okay, I was just wondering. And is the cut and carry, I don't mean to take all your time, but is it fresh? I'm not really familiar with that term. Is it a fresh mulch or is it quite dry?
Well, we actually purchased baled hay.
Okay.
I know a lot of people that do cut and carry will use, their own that they've cut on their own farm. We don't have the equipment to do that, although I would love to. There's some times in the past where we've had somebody come in and mow a field, and we've literally by hand, gone out and gotten it and used it right away. But right now, we just try to get a good quality, organic hay. And I think it's putting something in the soil. I don't know if it's, causing any of the other imbalances or if it's just staying fairly neutral. But I'm really curious about the nitrogen that we ended up with in those beds at the end of the research.
Sandy, there's a question in the chat asking about how you're planning to or how you have managed your high magnesium.
I didn't realize it was so high in the field before. We've had it really high in the greenhouse. And basically, I think if we can number one, get the biology up. I can sound like a broken record with that, but I think that, can be really huge. But getting some more humates out there, getting some more calcium that would be, maybe more, I don't know, readily absorbed. I've been looking at some different recommendations, and those seem to be what I've been finding just to try to balance it out a little bit more. Putting gypsum out, we don't want to raise the pH anymore out there. So maybe, getting some more sulfur, um, putting gypsum out there. We're going to give that a try and see if that makes a difference.
There
Any
one
other
more
questions?
question for Sandy before we move to Rue? Okay. Well, I think if people are available to stay on after, we can stay past noon as well if any more questions come up. But thank you so much, Sandy.
Sure. You bet.
Rue, I will pass it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. Sandy, that was fascinating to hear about. I've been really
Oh my gosh.
looking
Thank
forward.
you. I always think I'm boring people.
No, you didn't bore me, that's for sure.
Thank you.
So let's see, I'll just share my screen. Is that showing up okay for everyone?
Great, Rue.
Looking good? Okay.
Yep, looks good.
So I'm going to talk about a different system that depends on rye mulch as kind of the basis for vegetable production. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different aspects of this, but before I get into it, I need to mention that it's definitely not just me doing this work. There's some really dedicated people out there taking a lot of measurements. So I've been working with winter rye for a while as a reduced tillage strategy, um, ideally a no-till strategy. And so that started in 2021, doing some on-farm trials at 3 different locations in southern Wisconsin. And the main two things that came out of those trials was I was surprised at what a challenge it was to get enough rye biomass to suppress weeds. Um, the farms where we were working varied a little bit in soil type, but were mostly heavy-ish soils, and I was not expecting that it would be so difficult to get enough rye biomass. But then also when we did get enough rye biomass to suppress weeds, we also suppressed the crop plants. And as Sandy was saying, in her system, she wasn't amending. She wanted to see what the systems did on their own. We had very minimal amendments in these trials, and so we were seeing a lot of nutrient tie-up by the rye. So I'm going to address these two questions separately. And the first couple of trials that I'm going to talk about are looking at how to maximize rye biomass with small scale tools that are going to be more available to folks who are growing vegetables at a smaller scale. So even though I've got 6 different methods across here, I think of them mainly as methods that involve broadcasting and then disturbing the soil to get good seed soil contact. So we either did that with 2 tillage passes separated by broadcast or by broadcast and then tillage, or we used a power harrow, the kind of implement that that Terry was just talking about. The other set of methods we started off by harrowing, and then we used a precision seeder that places the seed in the soil. So either an earthway or a jang. We used a 3-row jang or a 3-row jang with double disc openers. The reason I wanted to try the double disc openers was because I wanted to be able to kind of try and replicate a no-till drill on the cheap. Um, Not that a Jang is all that cheap, but it's certainly less expensive than a no-till drill. And we were going into mowed buckwheat residue. So I knew that we would have some material to cut through. So what I'm going to be showing you is the information from our 2024, our fall 2024 planting that we started off with buckwheat, we seeded rye and vetch into the mowed buckwheat. We made 30-inch beds that alternated with white clover because we wanted to have living aisles. That was mainly to make it easier for us to walk in there and be able to collect data. But also I just really like having white clover living aisles. And then we roller crimped all of the rye beds and monitored them for weed suppression. So comparing these as basically two vault methods, what I saw in December of that year was that where we had broadcast the seed in any combination of tilling or harrowing, we had really nice cover already, up to about 30 or a little over 30% cover, um, in all of those beds. Whereas where we had precision seeded, we had slower emergence and we got more like 10 to 20% cover. So that had been a fairly dry fall, and then we got quite a lot of rain right before mowing the buckwheat. Um, so I think the broadcast seed was just a little bit shallower, had enough moisture that it was able to come up pretty quickly. Whereas maybe just the depth of seeding on the precision seeded, it came up a little more slowly. But it did catch up by the time we got to terminating the rye in the spring of last year. This is just a graph showing you how much biomass we had on a per acre basis. And so these first three methods are the methods where we had broadcasting as part of the method. And then we have the use of the harrow with either the earthway, the jang, or the jang with double disc openers. So all of these are above what is, based on research, the target amount of rye to get good weed suppression, 10,000 pounds per acre. I do want to make a note about the double disc openers. Even though that seems to have contributed to a slightly higher amount of rye, it was an absolute bear to get that through the buckwheat biomass, the buckwheat residue that was left. Because we had that rain right before we mowed the buckwheat, it was pretty wet and it took a while to break down. And Thomas was there in the field with me, pushing these seeders through, and can attest to how often we had to stop and unplug those double disc openers. So it worked. It's not something I would recommend if you have more than very minimal biomass, but it worked. And then we got really nice weed suppression. I think again, because we had such high levels of biomass. This is the crimper that we used. It's a small scale mechanical crimper that uses spring pressure to hit the rye as it goes over and crimp those stems so that they die. We had to crimp a little bit late, again because of rain. That's a little bit of a theme. And I think because, again, we had that rain, we had that softer surface of the soil, we did get fairly effective crimping, but the rye died down fairly slowly over the course of about 3 weeks. And we did have some viable seed that germinated at about 6 weeks. But for 6 weeks, we did no active weed management in these beds, and we had very low weed pressure. So if you've ever wondered how effective rye is going to be in a system like this at suppressing weeds, I can say that you will get at least 6 weeks where there is not too much that you need to do. That's assuming that you don't have a lot of perennial weeds. Perennial weeds will pop right through. That's something that we experienced in our on-farm research previously. But if you are mostly trying to suppress annual weeds, the system works really nicely. In early July, we started to see weed cover increasing, and I think that's the point at which um, if you haven't been able to take out those weeds, those few weeds that come through early in the season, that's the point at which you might start to see problems. So it's not that it's a completely hands-off weed suppression, it's just we did this in a hands-off way so that we could get the data of what weeds will come through. So I'm going to turn now to talk about how well cabbage production did in these systems. So for our cabbage production, we were comparing 3 different methods of terminating rye, which ended up turning into 4 different methods because of some weed issues that I will talk about in a moment. So for all of these kinds of systems where you're trying to get that high biomass of rye, you want to be planting at a pretty high rate. You want to be planting fairly early, so around 3 bushels per acre, and planting no later than early October is what's recommended. So the methods that we used for terminating the rye, our control method was to mow and till. You can see still quite a lot of rye residue here, but that broke down over the season. Then we had a roller crimp method that we ended up adding landscape fabric to half of those plots in 2025. And then we also have a method where we roll down the rye. We cover it with a silage tarp and leave that on for 3 weeks to kill the rye. In this system, we did have some walkways that we just crimped and then left so that we would still have those rye roots in the walkways. It's an alternative to a living aisle, which also makes it pretty nice to walk in those rows. So this is how the rye looked in, actually this picture is probably from late May in 2024 and then June in 2025. We crimped a little earlier in June. You can see that the rye is a little more green and lush, versus in 2025 we were delayed a little bit by weather and it did start to get a little more dry. Something that we were aware of before we crimped was that we had a little bit less biomass than was ideal in the 2024 crop of rye. And something we discovered after we crimped was that, well, actually we could see it already. We knew it was in there. There was annual ryegrass that was coming through. So in 2023, I should say, this is all work that we're doing at a research station on the west side of Madison. So some of the field areas are managed by the station superintendent, and in the previous year, she had put down annual ryegrass, but we had had a pretty severe drought that year, and evidently much of that seed had never germinated, but it was very happy to germinate the following spring and to compete with our rye cover crop. So this ryegrass was, I don't know if you can ever terminate ryegrass with a crimper. It was not at a stage in June that it could be terminated by a crimper, and it popped right back up. So at that point, we made the decision that we weren't going to learn much from these beds going into cabbage, and we decided to put landscape fabric over those. In June 2025, we had planted enough rye that we could do a comparison of just roller crimping to just roller crimping and then adding landscape fabric. Just to show you that we did see some competition from the annual ryegrass, that's in green here. This is our the amount of rye we would ideally get to give good weed suppression. And in 2024, we were well below that level for our rye, and about half of our biomass was annual ryegrass. In 2025, for the roll crimp method that had longer to grow, we did get up to that 10,000 pounds per acre amount. And I just want to insert a reminder here that if you check out Etienne Sutton's work, she presented last month. She has done some really nice work figuring out ways to estimate how much biomass you're getting from rye by taking an overview photo and then also measuring the height of the rye. So that's a pretty simple way to do that. And she can be contacted by looking for the Great Lakes Cover Crop Project, or get in touch with me or Emily and we can put you in touch with her. So here is how the cabbage looked planting into these systems. It grew pretty well in all of the systems. You can see the residue that we still have from the silage topped beds and the residue we have from the roll crimp beds. And then this is what it looks like when we put the landscape fabric over that roll of crimped rye as well. I want to talk a little bit about the labor that each of these required. We tracked labor through the year, and I've got the summary here in the table, and then a breakdown of different times of year over on the right-hand side. So in all cases, using the roller crimper and then laying fabric was the least labor-intensive method, which is not surprising. That really takes out all of the weeding that you would need apart from weeding through the planting holes. In 2024, we had a lot of grass weeds, which were mostly the annual ryegrass coming through. And so in both of the methods where we did not have fabric covering, we had to spend a lot of time on weeding. In 2025, where I would say it was a more typical situation for the kind of broadleaf and grass weeds we have at the station, it was, again, the easiest was having fabric. Using a wheel hoe and hand hose to weed in the tilled areas went pretty fast. And then both of the methods where we had a lot of residue, either from silage topping or from roller crimping, were a little bit higher in requirement for weeding. And you can see that broken down. Bed prep takes a little bit longer for the silage top and the fabric because we're handling that material. We got a lot better at it between 2024 and 2025. So that's definitely something where there's a learning curve. And then planting was really no different, which was interesting to see. It went about the same speed regardless. It was not significantly harder to plant into the rye, I would say. We used trowels. We have used the bulb auger on a drill before, and I actually ultimately prefer using a trowel. And then, as you can see, as you'd expect, so weeding time was quite a bit more in 2024, and where we had tillage, we did have a lot more weeds coming through, and so that actually did take more time, whereas it was a bit more even in 2025. Sandy mentioned ground squirrels, or it was another rodent actually, I think you mentioned. We saw quite a lot of ground squirrel damage, and what I want to highlight here is that it was definitely higher, 5%, 2.5% to 5% where we had a lot of residue. And we still had some damage in the tilled plots. And then I got a bee in my bonnet and decided that I thought hawk perches would fix the issue. And so we put them in, and there was absolutely no change in the high residue plots this past year. They had just as much damage from rodents but we did not see any damage in the tilled plots. So the hawks got some meals, but I think if you do have rodent issues and you're going to use a high residue method, you're going to need to have another solution other than just encouraging hawks to come. We also had supplemental fertility as part of the cabbage trial. As I mentioned before, we'd seen poor performance, stunting, and some evidence of nutrient deficiency with our on-farm trials where we had a very minimal fertility amendment system. We used 3 different rates, 140 pounds per acre, 180 or 220 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we did mid-season assays of the soil and tissue in 2024. We did not see any strong trends, but we did see that those levels were slightly higher in the plots that had been roller crimped and then had landscape fabric put over those, both for soil nitrates and also for cabbage PDL nitrates. So our initial thought is that the fabric is allowing a little bit faster breakdown of the rye residue. The rye residue could be tying up upwards of 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, so that could be a fairly significant contribution if that's getting released a little faster. And then finally, looking at yields, comparing 2024 and 2025, we weren't able to get the storage number 4 cabbage that I had used in 2024. We had to switch to another variety. And so that might explain some of the differences we're seeing. In 2024, we did not really see much of a response to nitrogen, which possibly is a feature of the variety. I'm curious to know if any of you grow it and have opinions about that. The blue squares are where we had mowed and tilled. And so at the lower nitrogen fertility amendment rate, we really didn't see any difference between the treatments. So the mow and till is the blue square, the green circles are the roller crimped with fabric, and the triangles are the silage tarped areas. And yeah, as I say, we did not see much of a response to nitrogen, and we did not see really big differences. The really big differences in yield between treatments, but if anything, the roll crimp fabric was trending a little bit higher. In 2025, with the cabbage variety Promise, we did see a slight response to nitrogen. We've got higher yields in the motil treatment as we go to higher nitrogen levels. It was fairly flat for roll crimp with fabric, which maybe means that the nitrogen that's being released from the rye under that landscape fabric is outweighing the addition of nitrogen from our spring amendments. And then for the other 2 methods, we do also see a very slight increase when we've got the silage tarp or the roller crimped method. There is a very slight response to nitrogen there as well. So it'll be interesting to see what we see with a second year with Promise, whether we see a similar response to nitrogen where we don't have that landscape fabric over it. So to be discovered. So my takeaways are basically, if you're curious about using a system like this, it's really important to make sure you have adequate biomass, but also to balance that adequate biomass with either making sure you're supplementing with enough fertility, or maybe considering a system where you're going to have faster breakdown of that biomass. And there was an interesting thread, email thread recently on the FairShare CSA Coalition listserv about managing rodents, and some discussion of snap traps as part of that solution. So it's great to have hawks around, but maybe think about an additional solution if this is something that you're going to try. So yeah, I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rue. Does anyone have any questions for Rue? Put them in the chat or come off mute.
I'm a little bit concerned about this year with some of our crops, not as much from gophers like we had before. Because we do have somebody that's been coming up and trapping, helps somewhat. The occasional snake added to the mix doesn't hurt either. But
Yeah.
rabbits, we're overrun with rabbits.
Um,
And I have never had issues with rabbits before, but they're getting into everything right now. So if anybody's got good ideas on that.
Hello. Hey, I have a question. Can you hear me?
mhm.
So, Rue and Sandy, you've gone through your research, knowing what you know now. What next? What do you think's going to work better moving forward? And also, lead poisoning is pretty good for rodents, but that's another story. Oh, but not lead. Not supposed to use lead. Sorry. Steel shot.
Yes. If you've got a keen
I
eye.
I I think my husband and son went Caddyshack on striped gophers one year that were taking out tons of newly seeded crops. I'm going to play more with the cut and carry mulch. Um, it I like the way the crops look with those, and it kind of fits into our rotation well. I don't use rye very often because I think with our heavy clay, we just have a hard time dealing with it when we want to terminate it or whatever. It takes a long time.
I think it depends a lot on what cover crops do well. If you can manage rye and you like working with it, I think it offers some really nice benefits. One of the things that I'm most curious about with rye and would love to look at more is its potential as a multi-year mulch, where if you can pair it up. Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit. With our on-farm trials where I worked with Clostrata, we used cabbage, winter squash, and peppers as our three crops, which was too much. Sandy is very smart to just do one a year, but we did all three every year. And cabbage did the best. The others were much more affected by the high residue and nutrient tie-up. So I think figuring out if there is a crop that works really well for your system in rye, and then if you can use that first year, ideally without landscape fabric, because I'm all about reducing plastics as well, um, then the second year, there's a lot of rye residue still left there, and maybe at that point, using a landscape fabric or some other kind of cover will allow you to have that be undisturbed for another year. Dylan Bruce uses a system like that and just raves about the tilth um, in those beds when he's been able to leave it in rye from like the fall of one year all through a production year and then all through another year. So I'm interested in working it into those kinds of longer systems and also in figuring out what are the particular vegetable crops that are going to be better adapted to a rye mulch system versus the ones that might need a little bit more feeding or just need a little bit of a more finely worked seed bed.
And, th- and then, if I might, just a quick follow-up. Any thoughts on varieties of rye? There's new varieties coming
Oh,
out and some incredible forage varieties, etc., versus just being run.
yeah. So I've worked with Aroostook ND Gardner, ND for North Dakota, and Spooner Rye. And I think ND Gardner and Roostook are two really great varieties. They produce a lot of biomass. I think it's worth getting a named variety. If you're getting variety not stated VNS rye, you may be getting something that is just not going to work well in our northern climates if it's been produced in a different part of the world. Not even a different part of the country, but quite potentially a different part of the world. It may be like just not well adapted. But I haven't used any of the forage varieties, Carl. That would be interesting to look at.
Rue, I'm wondering how well, first of all, I have an army of cats for the rodents. I recommend at least half a dozen really nice barn cats. I'm wondering about the planting those small cabbage plants in all of that mass of the stems net of the rye. Just wondering how do you do it? Is it slow, fast? What's your technique?
Yeah, so that rye can pop up quite a bit. Like it doesn't stand right back up, but you end up having a fairly deep amount of mulch. Um, and so yeah, you're definitely having to part the mulch a little bit to be able to get in there. Like I was saying, I prefer just using a trowel or a hori soil knife. I find that the hori especially has a long enough blade that you can get in there and open up a planting hole. And when I was using the drill with the bulb auger, I think it's partly because the soils where we were using that were higher clay, and I felt like we were just making a little compacted clay cup in the ground, and then the roots weren't able to break out of that very well. But it's one of those things where your mileage may vary depending on your soil texture. Um, and because we were planting into the tilled beds in the same way, there wasn't really much of a difference in the time it took. Thomas, I know that this past year you got the crew working a little bit differently. Do you have anything you wanted to add about how you did that? Whether
Could you
you
repeat the
measured,
question?
you laid out the plants first. When you were
Oh,
planting, whether you had people working in more of a team where someone was laying out the plants and someone else was planting them, or was everyone
um,
doing like making the planting holes and doing everything themselves?
yeah, because um, so really it was just laying out um, the tape, and then I put a plant every 3 feet and then estimate the one in between so I don't have to do math. Because you can do three to, we had like what, about 60 feet. Um, and then just a hand trowel if the soil needed it. In our case, mostly it did. Sometimes the till didn't, which is maybe why it was slightly faster in some cases. Um, but yeah, it would just be like a group of two, and then you just meet in the middle and kind of clean everything up and move to the next one. And with landscape fabric, it could go slightly faster because the holes are already marked. Um, in the case of this labor data, we didn't, I think we mostly had the tape out and then started timing ourselves, but I suppose you could say it takes a little longer for the other treatments to, if you, yeah, did everything from scratch or from without the tape. Yeah, you could get right to the ground. There wasn't really any vegetation issues, or the bulb auger I don't think would have helped in any way. Um, when planting trees, we always had to, like, you talk about that clay schmear, that the roots don't penetrate. They always recommend hitting the edges of those holes. So it sounds like an extra step if you use the auger.
Any other questions? If not, Sandy and Rue, thank you so much for sharing your research today. You definitely did not bore anyone, Sandy. It's great to hear.
Thank you.
So, thank you all so much. We will be meeting a week earlier in March, so be on the lookout for the invite for that. And talking with growers who are a little bit earlier in their on-farm research.
Thank
And
you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.